That happens when you've managed your project correctly. You meet your deadlines. All right. So anyway, my name is Dev. This is Practical Project Management. This has been the longest I've ever been in Madison, Wisconsin, since I showed up last night. The town's really cute. I had an awesome grilled cheese sandwich today from a truck outside. It was great. Still not really used to the cold. But we're going to talk about project management. There is a lot of theory and practice on this. And I'm going to try to get through it in about like 20, 25 minutes, so we've got some time to chat about stuff afterwards. But at the beginning of all of these presentations, there's always kind of this, like, I call it the identity crisis slide, where you have to say, like, wow, who am I? Like, what have I done? Why am I here? So I'm going to try to get through that pretty quickly. My name is Jana. I am currently the president of Code and Noises at Devinari LLC. We are working on our... By working on, I mean I got it to release candidate 1 last week. I'm actually really excited. This week, finishing up the project to get to certification for Microsoft. Our first game will be on Xbox One, Mac, and PC in February, hopefully. I am also the director of instruction for full stack development at Prime Digital Academy, where I teach full stack web development during the day. So I call my night game development thing my superhero alter ego. So what have I done? I'm a developer, designer, sound designer, musician, blah, blah, blah. Quickly, I'll go through the history. That's what I've been doing for about the last year and a half up in Minneapolis. Or is it down in Minneapolis from here? Over in Minneapolis? Not really sure which direction it is on a map. Before that, I was out in LA where I was the project manager for Image Metrics, which is best known in game circles for doing the facial animation stuff for Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption, Benjamin Button, stuff like that. But while I was working there, we were focusing on using the facial animation stuff for 3D augmented reality, facial animation for projects for L'Oreal and Nissan and stuff like that. That was when I really got into project management and realized, holy crap, how am I going to get this app that we've released in France, USA, and China ready to release in 68 countries with different languages by the end of this year? Like you don't do that without a good plan. Meanwhile, we were continually rolling out new features to the existing app. So also dealing with clients and stuff like that. So before that, I was back in Minneapolis and I was working on real-time interior rendering, architectural stuff. That was actually pretty interesting. We didn't have much of an overlap between different teams, so I got started doing project management there, but I didn't really have the theory down yet. I was just kind of working on it. And then before that, I was working on 3D animated iPad apps for the medical industry, and then before that I was teaching in Vermont, and before that I was making iPad and iPhone games. This was back when they were like brand new. It was really weird. It's hard to think about that, but remember when people would pay money for apps? It was back then. Did some indie games, and I worked on like the Stargate game in 2010 and things like that. So a few years ago I started taking project management pretty seriously, and I realized that it impacted my life as much as my projects. Like my stress level was lower just in general. I wasn't having when I had midnight coffee enough that midnight coffee became a term that I would say. I realized that I was working a little bit too hard, just a little bit too hard. And I realized that managing the project and the expectations better would be really helpful. So I'm here to talk about basics and benefits of project management, how it can benefit you, your project, your team, your life. If anybody else saw Warren Spector's opening comments, he said, like, let everyone know what your goal is. So my goal here is to really talk about the importance of workflow. So we're going to get to that in a little bit. We're going to do some, well, this is what we're doing. We're going to talk about what project management promotes, what it mitigates, some basics of Agile and Scrum, and then workflow clearly is in all caps there. That's going to be kind of the focus of how we're going to move this stuff forward. And if we've got time, we'll go over some real life examples and do some general discussion. All right. So you'll see characters from our game that's going to be coming out just because the slides were pretty boring without them. I'm not the artist. Ari is the artist, and I think his art is really cute. And it's really just kind of a boring slide. Have I mentioned how boring these are without his art? Because they're pretty boring. So a couple of things that project management promotes is certainty. And I think certainty is actually one of the most difficult things to get on a game project. How far along are you? How far from release are you? Is that feature done? Does that menu work? It's actually really hard to be certain about that type of stuff. And if you manage your project correctly, or even like kind of correctly, you have much more certainty about those types of things. It also gives you some awareness about where you are in the project, and if there is a Scrum board or something like that to which other people can go, you have an opportunity to talk about where the project is with the other people on the project. So it's nice to have that awareness and not have to go to them all the time or like send an email and then wait for them to get back to you via email. And that, of course, is the communication aspect, which is usually the messy part, right? You ask somebody like, oh, is that done? They say, yeah, it's done. And you don't believe them. Or you do, and you shouldn't have, like something like that. Those kinds of things happen. The main things that they mitigate, I broke this up into like really 4 little bits that project management mitigates if it's done correctly. And things being lost to the ether, and we see this happen all the time. It just disappears. It was forgotten. It was improperly prioritized. It should have been prioritized higher, but somehow the bells and whistles got in the project, but that core feature didn't. I don't know how that happened. We hear people say this all the time, or at least I do at work, is, oh, I lost track of that thread. Has anybody ever heard somebody say that? So I see a shaking head, I was like, oh yeah, my boss says all the time. Yeah, like those types of things happen, and often you just kind of run out of time, which usually is symptomatic of the fact that you didn't realize how much time you had left, or you didn't recognize how long the project itself would take. Big balls of mud. If anybody has ever looked up big balls of mud online, you should really check it out. It's an old, bad side effect of not managing your project correctly in software. And you can tell some of the pages that deal with it, you can tell were created in like the early 90s. So you can tell like these people had been working with this problem in software for so long. As soon as there was an internet and they could vent about it, they did. But it's really, really excellent to read about. But the idea is that you've got this like giant project and there's no high-level architecture. So nobody knows how all the pieces fit together. Everybody just kind of ran to the computer and started coding, and there's no scaffolding that holds the whole thing together. Usually, this has a very high, I would say, over-reliance on personal knowledge. So how does that work? Oh, you got to go ask so-and-so because they're the only one who knows how that works. Because there was no plan before they wrote it. They just wrote it. You usually see a lot of bloated code. This one is really hard to untangle. If you've ever like inherited a code base from someone, or I see some smirky nods happening out there, or if you've like downloaded a node package or something, once you're like, how is this even working? I could rewrite this in 15 lines of code. Well, first of all, you're probably wrong. You probably could do it in 15 lines of code, but also it was just a big ball of mud. They had an idea, but they didn't have a plan before they started coding. Feature creep, we've all lived through this. I like to say this is when the could voices shouted down the could voices shouted down the could voices. Did I say that backwards? Could shouted down would. I think could and should are 2 different words. You're like, oh, could I do that? And the answer is almost usually yes. We're developers, we're designers, we're problem solvers. But should you do it is a totally different question. And I think another good question to ask yourself is can and will. Those are 2 different words. Can I do this? Yes. Will I do this, or will I be able to do this in my given time with my budget? 2 completely different words. So you get seduced by some new feature. It's like this new shiny object. You're like, oh, squirrel, and you just go off in that direction. But it's usually not represented in the feature set, in the initial feature set. So that is your first red flag. Nope, I shouldn't be doing this. I should get the important stuff down, which is already in there first. And this is the thing right here that people kind of forget about, is that this introduces really bad late-stage bugs. Because these have been added like mid-stride, they add these bugs that no one saw coming. They are nowhere near as well designed as other aspects of the project. I just kind of made this name up for black holes. I don't know how to explain them. I think other than to say that they're like black holes, but people think of them as feature creep sometime, but I think they're different. It's when you add a feature to the project, not because you got seduced, but because the original design didn't actually address what needed to be addressed. So the classic example that I give for this is when clients for like web projects will say, we want to be able to delete users. And then you find out later what they really are saying is they want to be able to deactivate users and then reactivate users. Or they don't want to like they don't want to destroy their legacy data so that they can still run analytics, which is very analogous to what we would do with player profiles. So you're like, oh, okay, that wasn't, I misunderstood what you wanted, or you miscommunicated it. We'll make it their fault. And we need to add this feature to it, and we need to add these resources to it. It's going to make the project a little bit late. These are a lot harder to predict, and they have similar side effects to feature creep. So they usually add late-stage bugs because you can't see how well that's going to change things. The reason I call them black holes is because you can't see them coming, but you can usually, just like a black hole, a light can't escape it, but you can kind of see the event horizon, like the light around it. It's like, oh, there's a problem here. I don't know what it is. So that's kind of why I call those black holes. All right, and there's a, don't let that slide fool you or scare you. There's a, I don't want to call it a stage, but there's a part of every project that I call spiraling the drain, where it's like, this is the end, and you're just kind of caught in this gravity well around it. You're never going to feel like you're done. You're just like, oh, we're done. Oh, no, we're not. Another problem. And this is a stage that if you manage, there's no escaping it. There's no escaping it. But I think it's way less painful if your project has been managed a little bit better as you approach it. So usually, this is where like the really bad bugs come up. And you're like, oh, we're going to launch next week. And like, oh, we totally didn't see that. Then guess what happens? People go into crunch. People make worse decisions when they're tired. Also, I see people at this point go like, I don't need to go to stand-ups. I have work to do. And I'm like, that's kind of why you need to go to stand-ups, so that you know what everyone else is doing. You're not going to bork someone else's system. So spiraling the drain, I think, is actually an essential part of a project. And what I'm hoping we can do is talk about how we can mitigate some of the pain for that. So let's review, if you're familiar with Agile, we're going to review some of this stuff. If you're not, this might be new. In very high buckets, we've got epics, stories, tasks, and subtasks. So an epic is like a really, really high-level objective. I call this a large bucket into which at least one feature will live. That should say into which at least one feature shall be poured, if I was using proper English. And a story is a user story. So these describe actions available to the user. I always feel like I'm like a third grader when I'm writing user stories, because you usually start them with I want. It's like, I want this, I want that, I want to be able to jump. I want to be able to wall jump. I want to be able to double jump. Those all make sense, right? I want to be able to pick up a new weapon. I want to be able to switch weapons. It's very easy to just start talking about your weapon system, and you're like, well, what are all the verbs that your verbs, I should have done with quotes on both sides, what are all the verbs that your user needs to be able to do? I find it personally very helpful to start with the user stories and then dump them into buckets and then break them down into tasks. So tasks are, well, they're kind of a task that needs to be completed, and they might have subtasks. I know that's a lot, but this example, I hope, makes a little bit of sense. So an epic for your game might be your player profile. That makes sense. Players have profiles, names, pictures. They might link out to their Twitter or something like that. They might have like a description. A story would be, I want to log in with my existing credentials. That makes sense? So a task inside of that story would be the login screen, or maybe modal. Those are almost all the right syllables in the right order. And related subtasks for that is actually a lot. You've got your input forms and fields, error messages for incorrect logins, confirmations for correct logins, button designs, click sounds, even just like the general design, where's it going to fit on top of the page? There's a lot more to that than like, I just want to log in. So by writing all this stuff down, you give yourself a better sense of how long it's going to actually take. All right. This is just a visual for like how the hierarchy can actually look. And I'm going to tweet out these slides a little bit later. So there's that. If you want to see them, they'll be available. But hopefully you'll see like you've got the big project, you got a bunch of epics. Inside of those, you've got stories. All those stories have at least one task. Those tasks might have some subtasks. You may have some tasks that aren't attached to stories, but they're just out there. A lot of those are often like fixing bugs or quelling bugs or something like that. They're not really part of a story. It's just this needs to be completed. Now, we're going to talk about what workflow is, and this necessitates like, what is a ticket? So a ticket, from how I've worked historically in the last few years, has been usually a story, a task, or a subtask. So something that could be assigned to somebody. So I could be like, oh, hey, I'm going to go back to this. The engineer that's doing the input form fields is also going to do the error messages, but the designers, the UI designer is going to do the button designs. Each one of those could be a ticket that is assigned to a person. Or if we're working on a smaller indie team, it might just be like, oh, login screen is assigned to me. I'm gonna take care of that. We're a 3-person team. I'm personally working a 2-person team right now, so every story gets assigned to an individual person. And what is the life cycle of a ticket? This, I think, is the most important thing. All this Agile stuff, it's really, really, really important. It's really useful. But if everybody on the team doesn't recognize or understand or agree upon what done means, you've got a problem. So just to put a quick example here. you're on a Skype, what is it, 2007? You're on a Discord with your team, and your artist and your designer and your producer are all, and your sound designer are all there, and someone's like, oh, did we get the new animation for character 7 yet? And the artist goes, oh yeah, it's done. What does done mean? That might mean that the artist is done animating it, but that doesn't mean that it has been imported into the engine or is playable by the player. So the concept of like, how does a ticket get from birth, which would be when it's opened, created, this is something that we need to do, to death, which would be we don't need to deal with it anymore, is one of the, if not the most important aspect of this entire thing. If you break your whole project down into epics, stories, tasks, subtasks, but you don't understand, your whole team doesn't understand what it means to close a task or to complete a task, it doesn't really matter. Like that is an agreement that I think it should be agreed upon, thus it would be an agreement, by the whole company or the whole team, but for some reason it's always overlooked when people are talking about this. So like, I think it's totally underdeveloped in most places, and it's always more complex than to do work in progress done. Oh, it's always more complex than that. It's not just like a to-do list where things get checked off. So I don't know if this seems simple or complex. Who thinks this looks simple? Oh, okay, cool. Who thinks it looks complex? Nobody cares. All right. So this was as simple as I could kind of get it for my last job. And it actually took me about a month of asking people on different teams, at what point are you done with a ticket if it gets assigned to you? So I'm going to just walk you through this, but this is a pretty straightforward, well, I can use my shadow. I can do like a dinosaur. But yeah, so creating a ticket would be its birth, and then it sits and it's open. And a lot of different places will allow people to just grab tickets and, what's the word I'm looking for, claim a ticket, and it becomes theirs, or they would get assigned it, at which point in time it would move over to work in progress. Or we could say, you know what, we're going to ignore that, and it would just move over to ignored. Does that make sense? So it's simple kind of flowcharty stuff here. Once it's been in work in progress for a while, whomever is working on it will complete their work. So this could be the animator completing the animation or the programmer completing that bit of code, and it gets resolved. So they're done with it. It's on their computer. The work has been done for them, but it hasn't been merged into the master. So it's not part of the actual project yet. So this is one of those areas where done gets conflated quite a bit. So like, I'm done with it as opposed to it's in the project, and then has QA seen it? If there is QA. If there is not a QA, maybe one person on your team usually goes through it and does the builds. Does that make sense? So if it's merged to master, it gets into QA, and then maybe it doesn't pass QA. Like, oh, it's actually broken. Let's reopen it. And it'll go back to being open. Or if it's, we used to call it QA verified or QAV. If QA verifies it, we can deploy it, which might be, if it's a mobile game, it might just go out in your next update, or it might just go into your final build. That's as simple as I could get this. And I think a lot of people see that and they're like, that seems like a lot of shit. And I'm like, yeah, but now everybody knows how to talk about a ticket. So if you're at that same meeting and you say, we've got this animation, is it done? The artist is now not going to say, yeah, it's done. They'll say, I've resolved that, or it is resolved. And everybody on the team kind of knows what's happening. Like, developing that common language is maybe the most important aspect of using this. And we can bring that back up in a little bit. But I want to talk about sprints. If we're going to talk about Scrum and Agile, a sprint is a regular, repeatable work cycle and Scrum methodology during which work is completed and made ready for review. They're basic units of development, less than 30 days, commonly 2 weeks or 1 week. I think that a retrospective at the end of every sprint is super, super helpful. You get to 2 weeks, you get to the end of the sprint, and everybody just sits around and talks just for a little bit, what went right, what went wrong, what are we going to do differently. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but you can weight tasks. So the project manager can say, like, oh, this is a really complex task, it gets a 20. This is a really simple task, it gets a 2. And then you have a sense of, after you complete a couple sprints, oh, our team can complete 270 tasks a week. Does that make sense? So you've got this sense of like, oh, this sprint, we put 500 tasks in it. Like we're not going to be able to do this, or everyone's going to have to work overtime. I know so-and-so's got a birthday that week, so they're not going to be able to do it. It gives you more of that certainty and awareness. So these are some Scrum boards. And so if you consider there's 2 weeks worth of work, I think this was a 1 week sprint, but these are the simplest. I know this is to do, work in progress, done. In this case, donezo. I don't think we cared much about that project. But with the ignored at the very least, or sometimes you put your stretch goals in here, or just like, if we can get to it this week, happen there. And there's a physical board here. Now this is GitHub projects. If anybody uses GitHub, it's actually really helpful because you can assign people to it. You can see their picture, who has been assigned to it. And then as we go back to the workflow example, you can see how I had ignored all the way on the left and deployed all the way on the right. Those become the columns for a Scrum board. So this is the simplest way we could do it. I've had ones that were like 20 wide, depending on if we had different teams. At one point in time, we had teams in 3 countries doing them. If you're working with a physical board, I actually really prefer working with a physical board. And one of the things that's fun about it is, here you can see these are colored with a colored stripe underneath. That was whomever claimed that ticket. So, if you're green, you would stripe it with green. When you claimed a ticket, you would stripe it with your color, and then you'd move it into work in progress. And then all the yellows, blues, and light blues, and pinks were different epics. So even even if you're not reading, you can't read these boards. I actually blurred them out so you couldn't read them. But you have a sense of how far through the project we are on each one of these sprints, right? Like this was actually Friday, so these 4 here should have been done, but we were pretty close. This was, I think, a Wednesday, so 1 week sprints, we're about halfway through. Okay, we're about where we need to be. Like you can get a sense of that at any point in time. It can help you go, oh, we've been behind on the last 2 or 3 sprints, so we need to talk to the client, or we need to maybe take a look at our feature set. All right, some of the tools. I just brought up GitHub. GitHub projects, they just launched it, I believe, last September. So if you use GitHub, they added a board that is very similar to Trello. Has anybody used Trello? Okay, yeah. Trello seems to have really taken off lately. Who bought Trello? I think Atlassian bought Trello, didn't they? Yeah, so now they own them and Jira. Jira is a little bit more expensive. Yeah, I agree. I really like Jira. There's also Redmine. So there's a few other things that you can do with these. I think that any of them are good. They're all good solutions. It's really just another tool. It's like, are you going to draw with a piece of charcoal, a pen, or a pencil? If you're a good artist, you're going to make it work. The physical board has some really, really fun side effects. Like it's really cathartic to take a bug that has been bothering you for a while off the board and smash it into the done column. There are some really, really fun aspects of that. And that's the majority of the content. So I wanted to say, if you're going to tweet out a picture, I know this is the dumbest one, maybe the least informative one, but this is the one to take a picture of, even just for your own notes. It's like the best thing you can do, even if you think you've got a great relationship with your team, is talk to them and be like, what is our workflow? You'd be amazed how different people think done is. Was that proper English? It might not have been. You'd be amazed how different the definitions of done are, even within your own team. So I think the next thing you can do is just go out and talk about your workflow, and then once you do, you can start thinking about, okay, what epics are we doing? I know a lot of times at these kinds of developer conferences, we spend a lot of time talking about, what is the purpose of your game? How are you trying to make the world a better place? And that's great. That's a scale upon which everybody should be thinking, but it's also very hard, or at least very unusual, to scale down to this level. Just go okay, how am I working with my team? It is important to have the right people, it's important to have the right tools, but this discussion is a little bit weird, it's a little bit difficult. I'm gonna say I'm gonna give a couple real world examples, just kind of in conversation here. And the first one is that we had an internal, very active Jira board, and then we had an external Jira board for our client at my job 2 jobs ago. And that allowed us to just not let them see, I don't want to say not let them see what we were doing, but not let them see some of the areas with which we were spending a lot of time in, and then have them focus on that. I don't know if anybody's ever done this when you show something to one of your clients and they just zoom in exactly on the one thing that you didn't want them to see and be like, oh, you need to get that done by next week. We're like, well, it's in the plan. It'll be done 2 months from now, which is when the project is launching. It's also very easy for your team to do that. Also, if one person doesn't buy into your project management, the way that you're running it, it breaks the whole thing. So if you've got even a team of 15 people, 5 people, 3 people, and one person isn't managing their tickets, you have no idea what's happening. At that point, and I think this is just a good like human being thing, at that point, like, is it best to yell at them or just figure out what it is they're willing to do, right? Like, know what your team is. Like, this is just another tool. Like, project management is about managing your project, which also means managing your team. That's not just like running your Jira board or something like that. So at that point, it's like, okay, well, maybe if what happens is I spend 5 minutes with you every morning and then every afternoon and just be like, oh, where are these things? And then you are the one who moves the tickets over rather than whomever you're talking to. Is that 10 minutes worth it? I think it's totally worth it. Now they don't have to like deal with that. You don't have to yell at them. You don't have to have that like really, you're gonna have that discussion again probably 2 weeks later, right? If it's something that an artist is really, really interested in doing, great. If it's something that they're not interested in doing because it's distracting them from their art, and I think all of us know, like some artists and developers, that 5-minute distraction to do maintenance can take you completely out of the zone, and it's totally worth it if you can take that distraction away from them, but still get that certainty and that awareness, and it also gives you a communication point with all of them. There usually is a little bit of like, okay, these are the tasks that I think you're working on, you know, like you might have to work on that stuff. But I think that is something to really recognize, that like project management isn't just managing the project, it's managing the people that are on your team. I have had, got a few minutes left, but yeah, I'm gonna post these slides online soon. I want to make sure that if there are any questions, we can address them. You can catch me at DevJana or at my email down there, but I will be posting these online pretty soon. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear. We'll start up here. Yeah. Yes, it absolutely was. So the question was, this is completely irrelevant, but I believe that picture was taken at the Mall of America. Yes, that was taken at the Mirror Maze in the Mall of America. Yes. All right. Please.
So if you get like off track and you're like actually like if you're struggling and there's team members who aren't getting their tasks done, what is the best thing to do to get back on track to make sure that you can meet your deadline?
Cool. Good question. So I think that could be its own conference, really. But the question was, if you are falling behind and there's a team member who isn't closing their tickets on time, how do you get back on track? I believe is that the gist of it, right? So there's a couple dimensions to that, and I think the human element is that person ever going to get those things done on time? Like it's very possible that either they're unmotivated, they don't have the skill sets they need. I've seen people just not have their workspace set up correctly. You know, like they spend an hour just like getting their workstation to actually get ready to work, and they're so distracted they can't get stuff done. And like, are they even where they want to be? Are they what they want to do? I think that's something that we hear a lot in creative spaces. The other one is like, if they are set up, is it the correct amount of work for them to be doing? And sometimes it's just not. I think that is that has been a very difficult conversation that I've had to have with people. Is like, okay, this is where we need you to be. I thought this was clear when this project started. I don't want to say like you have to come down on them, but you have to understand from where they're coming. And I can't really say that there's one way to approach that with everybody. But the vast majority of it is usually going to be like, are you capable and ready to do the work? And that has as much to do with their surroundings. And then like, can you do the work? Like, will and can, again, are kind of like two different things. Like, can you do the work? It's like, okay, I am here, I'm present. And like, can you do the work is a totally different thing. I will say that there are some people who believe that working hard is the answer, and like, oh, but I've spent 12 hours on this yesterday, And that is something that I get a lot, and it's like, well, that's great, but I would rather you spend 2 hours on it and have it be done. Does that make sense? So like sometimes just realigning is like, okay, well that's great, but like let's not focus on the amount of effort, but the amount of accomplishment that you've done. That can help make it not be a personal argument. Something I say a lot is like burn bright, not hot, if that makes sense. So if you can encourage people to do that, usually that'll help. I'm not sure I fully answered your question there, but hopefully that helped a bit. Yeah, and going back to the concept of, I didn't really talk about it much, but the burn down chart, which is when you know how many complexity points you can do in a week. If you know how many complexity points you can do in a week, and you know how many are in the project, you actually get this line, this slope, where we're closing 250 every week, 250 every week. You can take that, and you can actually calculate the slope, and you can be like, well, when that slope gets to 0, that's our completion date. And if you're not behind on the completion date, then you've got room to let people have a little bit more time to get their jobs done. Is that it? Any other questions? Oh, yes.
As a project manager, how much importance would you put on being consistent with like providing the context of what a sprint is going to accomplish after it's complete? And do you often go over like the consequences of failing to complete a sprint on time?
Yeah.
That kind of
Yeah. I like going over the consequences of failure. That's actually one of my favorite things to do. I also like I get yelled at for this a little bit, but once people get used to it, they don't mind. Is I'll be like, okay, 76 hours till launch. You know, like I'll actually like walk around and do that so that the stress doesn't come at like, are you ready? We're launching in five hours. Like I will lead up to that. I'll actually, if it's a really big one, we had a solid big one a little bit ago, and I was like, all right, we've got 2 weeks, 3 days, and 47 hours. 3 days, 47 hours. Who'd break it up like that? But I would be like that specific with it during our stand-ups, and that breaks it up. And then I'll always be like, and if we don't make this deadline, we lose this contract, or this bonus is off the table. So I think that is hopefully I think that answered both your questions really. Yes.
What was your workflow with New 20? With the two-man project, did you follow this? Exactly?
Kind of.
Did you break away and do your own thing because you...
I did. So, and I can show you it, or not. Oh, I thought I could. So I did something a little bit different for a small project, which I think that's a very good question. It's like if you've got a really small project, like it is run a little bit differently. And a lot of these lessons came from the fact that my artist didn't want to really open and close the tickets. So we're at like 99% right now, so this isn't going to mean much. But we've got queued, work in progress, the log, what is closed and what has been ignored. And I'll go to the log. So the log is the current sprints log, and work in progress is what's happening right now. And what I did here was just, this is something I just built because we needed something. But what it did was it just focused on one column rather than the entire board, so that at any point in time we could be like, oh, this is how much we have left to do in this particular sprint. Which I mean, thanks for bringing that up. That's actually a really, really helpful thing when you've only got a couple people on your team, so that you'll be able to address what's happening. Okay, I think that's about my time. So if you got any questions, I'll be around for a bit. Thank you.